Good afternoon. My name is Tyler Sams. I'm the preacher for the Judson Road Church of Christ in Longview, Texas. Thank you for joining me this afternoon as we continue our series of Bible studies looking at the identity of Jesus. And today our Bible study takes us to John chapter 4. If you've got your New Testament, be opening up there to John chapter 4 as we'll be looking at Jesus' interaction with the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. This, of course, comes on the heels in the book of John of Jesus back in chapter 3, having his conversation in the evening with a teacher of the Jews by the name of Nicodemus. And then chapter 3 ended, if you'll remember, with John the Baptist giving testimony about who Jesus was. And now we're into chapter 4, and beginning at verse 1, when therefore the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, he left Judea and departed again into Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. And Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman therefore said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman?" For the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God, and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." She said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us the well and drank of it himself, and his sons, and his cattle?" Jesus answered and said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water shall thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so that I will not be thirsty, nor come all the way here to draw." And he said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." There's more to the story. We'll pick up with that later. But that's enough to get us started here. And the first point is we're seeking to understand more about Jesus and who Jesus is from these stories we find in the New Testament. One thing we learn about Jesus here is that Jesus sees people as people. Jesus is not prejudicial. It shocks the woman at the well that Jesus would engage her in conversation and engage her publicly in conversation. Right? This is not something that is happening behind the scenes. This is not something that is happening privately. Jesus is engaging this woman in public and open conversation. People see it. In fact, in verse 27, Jesus' disciples came and marveled that he had been speaking with a woman. So notice that there are two things of significance happening here. Number one, Jesus is engaged in public conversation with a woman, which is shocking to some. To others, it was shocking, and to the woman especially, that Jesus would be interacting with her because he was a Jew and she was a Samaritan. The Jews and the Samaritans had a very, very contentious relationship. The Jews looked at the Samaritans as almost some sort of half-breed of Jew and therefore worthy of their disdain. Jesus, when he was giving his instructions to his disciples, as he was giving what we might call the limited commission over in Matthew, said, "Don't go to the Samaritans, don't go to the Gentiles, but go to the Jews." And so I think that's kind of reflective of the way that many Jews saw the Samaritans. This stems from way back, if you remember in your Old Testament history classes, you had 2.5 tribes of Israel that decided not to stay in the Promised Land, but settled just outside of the Promised Land. Eventually, you've got Ephraim and half the tribe of Manasseh that settle there outside of the Promised Land proper. And what ends up happening is when the Assyrians come in and take over the northern kingdom, it was the practice of the Assyrians when they conquered a people to take the people captive and to move in new people. And 2 Kings chapter 17 is a record of this, that the peoples, the foreign peoples, that the Assyrian king would move into this area of Samaria. Well, when the people got there, there were a large number of lions in the town, in the area. The people who were newly imported there, thinking that it was because they had dishonored the gods of the lands, sent about and inquired and found a Jewish priest to come in, who they thought if he came in and taught them the ways of Judaism, that somehow that would placate the God of that particular land. Well, what ended up happening is the Samaritans developed some sort of a half-breed, we might call it, of Jewish religion, where they accepted the law of Moses, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but were they were doubtful and skeptical of any further revelation of the Old Testament. And so the prophets, the writings, the Psalms, the things like that, were all cast by the wayside for the Samaritans. And so you have a great distinction between Judah, Israel, the southern kingdom, and between Samaria, what used to be part of the northern kingdom but was now its own nation. Well, this woman to whom Jesus is speaking comes from Samaria. She is a Samaritan. And Jesus, crossing all social and political lines, begins to speak with this woman. He asks her to give him a drink. This would have been unthinkable to many Jews. Many Jews would have considered any eating or drinking utensil touched by a non-Jew to be unclean. Of course, that wasn't something that was found in the law of Moses. That was something that had developed as a Pharisaical tradition. It wasn't right. It wasn't part of the law of Moses, but nonetheless the Pharisees had kind of co-opted it as such. But Jesus puts that ideology to rest. He speaks to this woman. He asks for a drink from her, shocking her, but leading to a greater and more impactful conversation. We shouldn't be surprised when we see Jesus interacting with people like this, because we need to remember Jesus created these people, right? You remember how John began his gospel account? In John chapter 1 and in verse 1, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. And then verse 3, all things came into being through him, and apart from him nothing came into being that has come into being. While the Jews of this time drew many different lines of distinction, here comes Jesus interacting with all of his creation. Not necessarily because they were worthy of his interaction, because let's be honest, who among us is worthy of the Son of God taking the time to be with us? But taking time and being with him and interacting with him because he saw value in them. And that was something the Jews failed to see. They didn't see other people as valuable and significant. But Jesus did. He created them. He was coming to serve them. And later he would give his life for them. Who is Jesus? We see Jesus seeing people as people. Go back to John 4. Let's continue our study here. What else do we learn here about Jesus? Well, in our reading, Jesus centers his conversation with this woman around the concept of water, right? Verse 10. If you knew the gift of God and who it is that says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. What started as a conversation about well water became a conversation about living water. And you see Jesus hint at his identity there in verse 10 when he says, if you knew the gift of God. When I see Jesus saying gift of God, my mind immediately jumps back to John chapter 3 and verse 16, Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus, where he said, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. I don't think the Samaritan woman would have had any inclination about the discussion that Jesus had with Nicodemus. But I think we see Jesus saying some things here in John 4 that for those of us who would come later and who would believe in him, John 17, based off of what he said and based off of what the apostles recorded, I think there are some great pieces to put together here that really make this section jump out to us. He is hinting at his identity when he talks about being the gift of God, and I think we ought to make that connection back to John chapter 3. But back to the story at hand here, she misunderstands Jesus. If you've got a choice back in this time period from two different water sources, you could have well water or you could have free-flowing water. Which would you choose? You would choose that free-flowing spring. Well water could get stagnant sometimes, though it might be fed from an underground stream. It could get stagnant sitting in there in the well waiting to be lifted out. She assumes that's what Jesus is talking about, that he's got some free-flowing water rather than this stagnant well water. Well, who wouldn't want that? Give me that water, Lord. Sir, give me that water. Sir, you have nothing to draw with and the well is deep. Where will you get that living water, that free-flowing water? But Jesus makes it clear to her, I'm talking about something more. Verse 13, Jesus said to her, everyone who drinks of this water shall thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. And while the woman is seemingly still going to miss the message, at least for the moment, verse 15, she said to him, Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty, nor come all the way here to draw. You see, she's still thinking in physical terms. Later, she'll make the connection with what Jesus was talking about. In verse 24, Jesus said, God is spirit. Those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called the Christ. And when that one comes, he will declare to us all things. And Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. And in verse 28, the woman left her water pot and went into the city and said to the men, Come see a man who told me all the things that I have done. This is not the Christ, is it? The giver of living water. Right? Water becomes a significant feature throughout Jesus' ministry. But here in verse 14, Jesus gives a water that quenches the thirst, that leaves one never to thirst again. It satisfies completely and leads, verse 14, to eternal life. Jesus is talking here about the satisfaction that he gives, the life that comes through him, the forgiveness of sins that is available and revealed to us in the gospel. And Jesus is the giver of living water. And then as we saw there in verses 25 and 26, who is Jesus? Jesus is the Messiah. You notice that throughout this conversation, Jesus draws the woman closer to a proper understanding of who he is. He begins as being a man, he's then a prophet, and then he is the Christ. Pick up with me there in verse 16 where we left off earlier. Jesus said to the woman, Go call your husband and come here. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. And Jesus said to her, You have well said, I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. This you have said truly. And then the woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, probably Mount Gerizim. And you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. But Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem shall you worship the Father. Notice Jesus speaking here of a change that would happen. A Jewish law that mandated worship taking place in Jerusalem would be changed. Something new is coming in. Verse 23, An hour is coming and now is when the true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshippers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming. When that one comes, he will declare to us all things. And Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. The Messiah had been spoken of in the prophets in the Old Testament. Daniel 9, for instance, talks to us a great deal about the Messiah using the word Messiah. But the Samaritans had rejected these scriptures. And so perhaps it is that this woman had done some studying on her own, or perhaps it is she understood the concept of the Messiah from passages in the Pentateuch. Jesus would affirm to us, as you flip back just very quickly to Luke chapter 24, Jesus would affirm to us that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, Jesus would affirm to us that those books actually did speak of him. Luke 24, and in verse 44, he said to them, these are his apostles, these are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Those were 3 divisions of the Old Testament to the Jew, the law of Moses being the first 5 books, and Jesus affirms that the first 5 books had things contained in there which were written about him. Perhaps the most obvious place that would be Deuteronomy chapter 18 in verses 15 through 18, where Moses spoke of a prophet who would be raised up like him from among the people, and that the people should heed him in everything that he would say. And of course, as you come over to the book of Acts, there's an application made of that passage. In Acts chapter 3, Peter, after the day of Pentecost, makes an application of that Deuteronomy passage and shows that Jesus is its proper fulfillment. And so perhaps it is the woman had made those connections. But it's interesting, she doesn't know who the Messiah is, just that Messiah is coming. She had gathered that much from her studies. But what a shock it would have been then to have heard this man who she now perceived as a prophet, who had revealed himself as someone who had divine insight, who was blessed, at least at a minimum, with revelations from God, when this man turns and says to her, I am the Messiah of whom you speak. And so in verse 28, the woman left her water pot. She went into the city and said to the men, come see a man who told me all the things that I have ever done. This is not the Christ, is it? And of course, verse 39 is going to record for us, from that city, many of the Samaritans believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified, he told me all things that I have done. You had people here who listened. Contrasted, verse 43, after 2 days he went forth from there into Galilee, for Jesus himself testified that a prophet has no honor in his own country. So when he came to Galilee, the Galileans received him, having seen all the things that he did in Jerusalem at the feast, for they themselves went to the feast. He therefore came again to Cana of Galilee, where he had made the water wine, and there was a certain royal official whose son was sick at Capernaum. And when he heard that Jesus had come out of Judea into Galilee, he went to him and was requesting him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. Jesus therefore said to him, unless you people see signs and wonders, you simply will not believe. Contrast between the Samaritans and the people of Jesus' own hometown. Who is Jesus, though? As he told the woman at the well here, he is the Messiah. And so as we try to understand who Jesus is from this interaction at Jacob's well, when we see Jesus seeing people as people, it affirms to us that Jesus is not prejudicial, but he is loving, and he is merciful. He's compassionate. He's interested in everybody. He's not somebody who's going to disqualify somebody just because they speak a different language, or their skin is a different color, or they come from a little bit of a different background. Jesus saw people as people. Jesus is the giver of living water. He is the gift of God, tying us back to John chapter 3 and verse 16, who brings salvation, who brings hope, who brings in the end eternal life. And at this conversation at Jacob's well, we find Jesus revealing himself as the Messiah. The word simply means the anointed one. He is the one anointed by God to the work of salvation and revelation. You remember the kings in the Old Testament were often inaugurated into their role as king by being anointed. They were being set apart into the special service that was before them. Here is Jesus, God's anointed, God's Messiah, God's Christ, who is here to do the work of God, the work of salvation and the work of revelation. Thanks for joining me today in this study of Jesus from John chapter 4. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I look forward to being back with you next Sunday. Have a nice rest of your day.